In the gilded age of ambition and ruin, a name was worth more than a soul. For 19-year-old Seraphina Beaumont, her name was the only currency she had left. To save her family from a disgrace that would shatter them into 1,000 forgotten pieces, she made a devastating bargain. She agreed to marry the Duke of Northwood, a man thrice her age, a creature of rumour and shadow, whose wealth was matched only by his cruelty. This is not a fairy tale of a beautiful girl taming a beast. This is the story of a vow made in desperation, a shocking deception at the altar, and the dangerous, unexpected love that bloomed from the ashes of a carefully laid plan. The London season of 1888 was a glittering, ravenous beast, and it was chewing the Beaumont family to the bone. From the outside, their townhouse at No. 12 Belgrave Square remained a bastion of old-world aristocracy. The white stucco facade was pristine, the windows gleamed, and the Beaumont crest, a stoic silver griffin, still adorned the wrought-iron gates. But inside, the rot had set in. The damask curtains were frayed at the edges, the silver was polished less frequently, and the quiet, pervasive chill in the grand halls had little to do with the English weather. Seraphina Beaumont felt that chill in her very marrow. At 19, she should have been the season's darling. With hair the colour of spun copper eyes, the shade of a summer storm, and a mind sharper than most of the young lords who courted her, she possessed all the requisite assets. Yet a shadow clung to her, an invisible shroud of anxiety that dulled her wit and stole the light from her smile. The shadow had a name, the Great Calcutta Shipping Collapse. Her father, Lord Alistair Beaumont, had always been more of a dreamer than a financier. He spoke of honour and lineage, but his ledgers bled red ink. Seduced by promises of exotic fortunes, he had staked everything the family's London house, their ancestral country estate in Kent, even his wife's collection of Cartier jewels, on a fleet of ships destined for India. When news arrived that the entire venture, mismanaged and over-leveraged, had sunk into bankruptcy, it was as if the ground beneath Belgrave Square had given way. The whispers started immediately slithering through the ballrooms of Mayfair and the gentlemen's clubs of St. James's. The Beaumonts were ruined. Lord Alistair, a man defined by his pride, began to physically shrink. He took his meals in his study, his face grey, with a shame so profound it seemed to age him by the hour. Seraphina's mother, Lady Beatrice, a woman who had once commanded society with a mere glance, now spent her days in a laudanum-induced haze, her grief a silent spectral presence in the house. It was into this suffocating despair that the proposal arrived. It came not in a perfumed envelope delivered by a footman, but as a stark, brutal business proposition delivered by a lawyer with eyes like chips of granite. The solicitor, a Mr. Finch, represented Alaric Sterling, the 6th Duke of Northwood. The Duke was a legend, and not a pleasant one. He was 75 years old, a recluse, who hadn't been seen in London society for 2 decades. They called him the Iron Duke, not for military valour, but for the ruthless way he had built his industrial empire upon the bones of his competitors. His wealth was obscene, rivaling that of the Rothschilds, drawn from coal mines, steel mills and railways that scarred the northern landscape. He was also childless, a widower twice over, and obsessed with his legacy. The deal was simple medieval in its crudeness. The Duke of Northwood would absorb all of Lord Beaumont's debts. He would restore the family's fortune, secure their properties, and ensure their name was cleansed of all scandal. In return, Seraphina Beaumont would become his wife, the Duchess of Northwood. He requires a bride of noble and untainted blood. Mr. Finch had stated his voice devoid of emotion. A young wife capable of bearing an heir. Your daughter, Miss Beaumont, has been deemed suitable. Suitable. The word echoed in Seraphina's mind like a death knell. She was a brood mare, a beautiful, well-bred piece of livestock being traded to settle a debt. When her father, his hands trembling, had laid the terms before her, she had felt a surge of nausea so violent she had to grip the back of a chair. She looked at her father's broken face, thought of her mother's vacant eyes, and the future of her younger brother Thomas, who was still at Eton and blissfully unaware. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an execution. "I will do it," she had said, her voice a reedy whisper in the cavernous, silent library. The weeks that followed were a surreal nightmare. Dressmakers arrived, their hushed tones and measuring tapes feeling like the preparations of an undertaker. A betrothal announcement was placed in the Times, causing a shockwave through the ton. The speculation was rampant. Had the beautiful Seraphina Beaumont lost her mind? Was she a saint, sacrificing herself for her family? Or was she a cold, ambitious shrew, trading her youth for one of the greatest titles and fortunes in England? No one knew the truth, and Seraphina offered them no clues, her face a serene porcelain mask that betrayed nothing of the tempest raging within her. She never met her fiancé. All communication was through the implacable Mr. Finch. A wedding date was set for the last Tuesday in September. The venue would be St. George's Chapel at Windsor, a statement of power and influence. The Duke, it was explained, was too frail to travel to London. He would be waiting. On the morning of her wedding, Seraphina stood before the mirror in a gown of ivory silk, so heavy it felt like armor. It was a couturier's masterpiece, a gift from the Duke, but to her it was a shroud. Her reflection was a stranger, a pale, solemn woman with haunted eyes. Her maid, a kind, simple girl named Mary, fussed with the veil, her own eyes red-rimmed with pity. "You look like a queen, miss," Mary whispered. A queen of ashes, Seraphina thought. The carriage ride to Windsor was silent. Her father sat opposite her, shrunken in his formal attire, unable to meet her gaze. He had been saved, but he knew the cost. He had sold his daughter. The rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves on the road was a countdown to the end of her life. She was no longer Seraphina Beaumont, a girl who loved to paint watercolors of the Kentish countryside and read poetry by Keats. She was a commodity, her transaction nearly complete. As the magnificent spires of Windsor Castle pierced the grey autumn sky, a final desperate prayer formed in her heart. Not for escape, she was too pragmatic for that, but for strength. Strength to endure the cold, withered touch of her ancient husband. Strength to bear the prying eyes of the world. Strength to forget the woman she was supposed to be. The carriage door opened. Her father extended a trembling hand. Seraphina placed her gloved fingers in his, took a deep breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of her heart, and stepped out to meet her fate. St. George's Chapel was an awe-inspiring cavern of stone and stained glass, but today its grandeur felt oppressive. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and old incense, a funereal perfume. The pews were sparsely populated, a testament to the Duke's reclusive nature and the shocking haste of the wedding. A few distant Sterling cousins, their faces pinched with curiosity and disapproval, sat on one side. On the other, a handful of Beaumont relations huddled together, their expressions a mixture of pity and relief. This was not a celebration. It was a somber, formal proceeding. As Seraphina walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her silk train whispering over the cold flagstones, every eye was on her. She kept her gaze fixed forward on the altar, where a stooped figure stood waiting. Duke Alaric Sterling was worse than the rumours. He was a desiccated husk of a man, propped up by a severe-looking valet on one side and a heavy silver-tipped cane on the other. His skin was the color of old parchment, stretched taut over a skull-like face. His eyes, buried in a web of wrinkles, were a milky, faded blue, and they stared straight ahead, seemingly unfocused. A persistent wheezing rattle emanated from his chest with every breath. Seraphina's stomach clenched. This was the man who would own her body and soul. The thought of his touch, his breath, made her feel faint. She reached the altar, and her father placed her hand into the Duke's. His fingers were like a bundle of cold twigs, dry and brittle. The Archbishop of Canterbury, a man with a weary, resigned face, began the rites in a low, somber drone. Seraphina drifted, her mind detaching from the moment. She heard the words to have and to hold, for better, for worse, in sickness and in health, and they sounded like a cruel joke. There would be no better, only worse. There would be no health, only this creeping, rattling sickness, until death did them part. A death she knew, with a chilling certainty, she would be expected to pray for. The Archbishop paused. If any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else, hereafter forever, hold his peace. It was a formality, a relic of a phrase that was never acted upon. A profound silence descended upon the chapel, broken only by the Duke's labored breathing. 1 second passed, 2, 3, and then the great oak doors at the back of the chapel boomed open, slamming against the stone walls with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. Every head whipped around, gasps rippled through the pews. Framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the grey daylight, stood a man. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed not in formal wedding attire, but in a well-tailored traveller's coat that was dusted with the grime of the road. He carried no weapon, but he radiated an aura of danger and command that filled the sacred space. He strode down the aisle, his heavy leather boots ringing out on the stone with an unnerving confidence. He ignored the shocked faces of the congregation, his eyes, a startling, intense sapphire blue, fixed on the scene at the altar. As he drew closer, Seraphina could see the details of his face. It was a strong, angular face, weathered by sun and hardship, with a square jaw darkened by a day's worth of stubble. A thin white scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a perpetually forbidding look. He was perhaps 30, a man in his prime, a stark, vital contrast to the decaying Duke. "Stop this!" the man commanded, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that carried easily through the chapel. It was not a plea. It was an order. The valet next to the Duke stiffened. The Archbishop blinked, his mouth agape. "Who are you, sir?" the Archbishop demanded, finding his voice. "This is a private ceremony. You are trespassing." The stranger came to a halt just before the altar, steps his gaze sweeping over the scene. He looked at the trembling Lord Beaumont, at the horrified face of the solicitor, Mr. Finch, and finally his eyes landed on Seraphina. For a fleeting second, the hardness in his expression softened, replaced by something unreadable, pity, perhaps, or assessment. Then he turned his attention to the old Duke. "Uncle!" The man said the word laced with a bitterness so cold it could freeze fire. "You are looking unwell." A murmur went through the Sterling cousins. Uncle, the old Duke seemed to shrink further. A flicker of something, fear recognition, passed through his clouded eyes. "Caspian," he rasped the name, a venomous hiss. "You are not welcome here. You were disowned." "I am still your brother's son," Caspian retorted, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "And I am still a Sterling. And I will not stand by and watch you shame our name with this grotesque spectacle." He gestured dismissively toward Seraphina, though his eyes did not leave the Duke. "Buying a child bride to secure your legacy Has your vanity finally consumed what little honor you had left?" Mr. Finch stepped forward. "Lord Caspian, you have no legal right to interfere. You were struck from the succession years ago." "Laws can be reinterpreted. Wills can be contested," Caspian shot back, never taking his eyes off his uncle. "Especially when the testator is clearly of unsound mind and body. Look at him. He can barely stand. This marriage is a farce, and I will see it aimed before a court of law. I will drag the Stirling name and the Beaumont name through every sordid headline in London. I will expose your debts, Lord Beaumont." He added his sharp gaze, flicking to Seraphina's father, who flinched as if struck. "I will ensure your ruin is absolute and permanent." Panic seized Seraphina. This man, this Caspian, was destroying everything. Her sacrifice would be for nothing. Her family would be cast into the abyss. But then Caspian did something entirely unexpected. He looked back at his uncle, a strange, predatory gleam in his eye. "However," he said slowly, "there is another way. A way to salvage this day. The contract has been signed. The dowry, in a manner of speaking, has been paid. The Beaumonts are saved. A marriage must take place to seal the agreement." He took a step forward, ascending to the altar. He stood beside his uncle, a towering figure of vitality next to a monument of decay. He turned to the stunned archbishop. "My uncle is not fit to take a wife. He is not fit to stand, let alone perform his duties as a husband. His mind is gone, his body is failing. To join him with this young woman would be a sin." He then looked directly at Seraphina, and for the first time, she saw the full force of his intelligence, the calculated brilliance behind the raw power. "I am Lord Caspian Stirling, nephew to the Duke, and by blood the next in line to the dukedom, regardless of this old man's pathetic attempts to write me out of history. The union is between the House of Stirling and the House of Beaumont." His voice dropped, becoming a personal, resonant declaration that seemed meant only for her. "I will take his place. I will honor the contract. I will marry Miss Beaumont. Today. Now." The chapel exploded into chaos. The Stirling cousins were on their feet, shouting. Lord Beaumont looked as if he might faint. The old Duke let out a choked, rattling gasp, his face turning a mottled purple. But Seraphina heard nothing but Caspian's words. "I will take his place." It was a trade of one cage for another, but the new cage was an unknown quantity. This man was not a dying relic. He was a storm. He was dangerous, unpredictable, and powerful in a way that had nothing to do with money or titles. He was offering her a different kind of damnation, but it was a damnation that was at least alive. The old Duke, enraged, raised his cane to strike at his nephew. The movement was too much. He choked his eyes, rolling back in his head, and collapsed into the arms of his valet, a string of spittle on his lips. In the ensuing pandemonium, as doctors were called and the old Duke was carried away, Caspian Stirling did not move. He stood before Seraphina, a still point in the turning world, his hand extended. Not in a gesture of romance, but of grim, unavoidable destiny. "Miss Beaumont," he said, his voice cutting through the noise, "it seems you are in need of a groom, and I, it seems, am in need of a wife." The ink was barely dry on the marriage certificate, a document hastily amended and signed in a small, wood-panelled vestry under the bewildered gaze of the Archbishop. Seraphina's signature was a spidery, trembling scrawl next to the bold, decisive slash of her new husband's Caspian Stirling, Duke of Northwood. The title was an act of audacious presumption. Old Duke Alaric was not dead, merely incapacitated by a fit of apoplexy, and bundled off to his rooms at Windsor. But Caspian had acted with the swift, ruthless efficiency of a field commander seizing an objective. Lawyers were summoned, clauses were invoked regarding the Duke's fitness, and Caspian, as his closest male relative, assumed control. He was now the acting Duke and her husband. Serafina felt as though she were watching a play from a great distance. She had been passed from her father to this stranger with the cold finality of a property deed. They were married. She was the Duchess of Northwood. The words held no meaning. The journey from Windsor to the Stirling ancestral seat in Northumberland was a long, tense affair conducted in a private railway carriage that reeked of old leather and her husband's cigar smoke. He had not spoken more than a handful of necessary words to her since the ceremony. He sat across from her now, staring out at the darkening English countryside as it rushed by, his strong profile etched against the fading light. He was a complete and terrifying enigma. Where had he come from? Rumours among the Stirling cousins had been flying in the vestry. He'd been a soldier, a mercenary, some whispered in Africa or India. He had quarrelled violently with his uncle a decade ago, over a woman or money or politics, no one seemed to know for sure, and had been cast out his name, forbidden to be spoken. And now he was back, a ghost returned, to claim a kingdom. Serafina studied him from beneath her lashes. He was not handsome in the classical aristocratic sense. His features were too harsh, his presence too unsettling. But there was an undeniable magnetism to him, a raw masculine energy that the drawing rooms of London had never produced. His hands resting on his knee were large and calloused, the hands of a man who worked and fought, not of one who dallied and danced. Finally, as the last vestiges of daylight surrendered to a bruised purple twilight, he turned his gaze from the window to her. His blue eyes were unnervingly direct. "I imagine you have questions," he said. It was not an invitation, but a statement of fact. Serafina clasped her gloved hands in her lap. "Several." Her voice was steady, betraying none of the chaos inside her. "Ask." "Why?" The single word hung in the air between them. "Why did you do it? You said yourself it was a grotesque spectacle. You shamed your uncle for it, and then you took his place." He leaned back, a humourless smile touching his lips. "My uncle and I have a long and storied history of mutual contempt. He sought to erase me from our family's legacy. He intended to sire a new, more pliable heir on a terrified young bride and ensure my line was cut off forever. Marrying you was not an act of chivalry, Miss Bow. Forgive me, Your Grace." The title sounded like a mockery on his tongue. "It was an act of war. I seized his most valuable asset and his entire strategy in one move. I am an asset." The words were colder than she intended. "In this context, yes," he replied without apology. "You are the key to the Northwood Duchy. Your family's name, your youth, your health. You were the vessel for his ambition. Now you are the vessel for mine." The brutal honesty was both shocking and in a strange way clarifying. He was not pretending this was anything other than a transaction. He was simply a different sort of merchant than his uncle. "And what is your ambition?" she asked, her chin held high. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze so intense she felt it like a physical touch. To restore the name of Stirling to something other than a byword for avarice and cruelty. My uncle bled the Northwood lands dry. He treated his tenants like serfs and his business partners like fools. He hoarded his wealth in a vault while the home of our ancestors crumbled around him. I will not allow his legacy of rot to be the final word." He spoke with a low, fierce passion that surprised her. This was not just about spite. It was about something deeper, a twisted sense of duty, perhaps. "And my role in this restoration," she pressed. "You will be the Duchess," he said simply. "You will be unimpeachable. You will be gracious, dignified, and you will stand by my side as we navigate the political and social battlefield that is to come. You will give the world the impression that this is a legitimate, powerful union. In return, your family is safe, their name is clean, and you will have a life of immense privilege and security. I will not demand anything more from you than that." The unspoken words hung heavily in the air. His duties as a husband, the part of the bargain she had dreaded with the old Duke. She had to know. "You said you would not demand more?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Does that mean—" Caspian understood immediately. A flicker of something, not kindness, but perhaps grim understanding crossed his face. "This is a marriage of strategy, not of passion. You are my duchess, not my chattel. You will have your own rooms. Your privacy will be respected. I will not come to your bed." An immense, dizzying wave of relief washed over Serafina, so powerful it almost buckled her composure. The most terrifying aspect of her fate had just been lifted. She would not have to endure the touch of a man she did not know, be it an ancient tyrant or this formidable stranger. "Thank you." She breathed the words heartfelt. He gave a short, sharp nod, as if her gratitude was an irrelevance. He turned back to the window, the conversation apparently over. They arrived at Northwood Manor late that night. The train stopped at a small private station, and a carriage was waiting. As they drove, Serafina peered out the window. The moon was a silver sliver, illuminating a landscape that was wild and beautiful, yet stark and unforgiving. This was a world away from the manicured gardens of Kent. The manor itself rose from the darkness like a sleeping beast. It was a sprawling Jacobean masterpiece of dark stone with towers and turrets that clawed at the night sky. It should have been magnificent, but it felt sad. Many of the windows were dark. The grounds were overgrown. It was a place of immense power and wealth, yet it felt profoundly lonely. The carriage rolled to a stop. A footman opened the door. Caspian stepped out, and after a moment's hesitation, turned and offered her his hand. His touch was firm and impersonal, but his grip was strong as he helped her down. The great front doors were opened by a butler who was as old and grey as the stone walls around him. His name was Hobbs, and his face was a mask of professional neutrality, though his eyes widened slightly at the sight of Caspian. "Lord Caspian," the butler said, his voice raspy with disuse and shock. We were not expecting you." "There have been some changes, Hobbs," Caspian said, his voice echoing in the cavernous marble-floored entry hall. "I have returned, and I have brought with me my wife." He turned to Serafina, who stood small and suddenly overwhelmed in the vast, shadow-filled space. "Hobbs, this is Serafina Sterling," he announced, his voice ringing with a note of indisputable possession. "The new Duchess of Northwood." The first weeks at Northwood Manor were a lesson in gilded isolation. The house was a labyrinth of echoing halls, dust-sheeted drawing rooms, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow Serafina with silent judgment. Her husband, the new master of this domain, was a ghost within its walls. He was consumed with the monumental task of wrestling the duchy into submission. He spent his days locked in the estate office with solicitors and land agents, his nights poring over ledgers that stretched back decades. Serafina was left to her own devices. She had been given a suite of rooms in the East Wing, beautifully appointed, but distinctly separate from Caspian's in the West. True to his word, he never crossed her threshold. They saw each other only at dinner, a formal, stilted affair held in a dining hall that could seat 60. They would sit at opposite ends of a vast, polished mahogany table, the distance between them, a chasm of unspoken questions, making polite, empty conversation about the weather or the day's non-events, their voices swallowed by the high vaulted ceiling. During her explorations of the manor, she began to piece together the story of the man she had married. His mother's portrait hung in a forgotten gallery, a beautiful, sad-eyed woman who had died young. She learned from Hobbs, the ancient butler, who seemed to be the only soul in the house, with a flicker of warmth, that Caspian had been raised here, a wild, headstrong boy who was the opposite of his dour, calculating uncle. Lord Alaric never forgave him for being his mother's son, Hobbs confided one afternoon as he showed her the neglected library. She was a vibrant spirit. The old Duke despises anything he cannot control. The staff, a skeleton crew of long-serving retainers, treated Caspian with a mixture of fear and a deep, reluctant respect. They had loathed the old Duke, but his nephew was an unknown and dangerous quantity. They treated Serafina with a cautious deference, their eyes full of pity. She was the beautiful tragic creature caught in the Sterling family's brutal crossfire. One crisp October morning, a new presence arrived at the manor. A carriage bearing a different Sterling crest rolled up the gravel drive, and from it emerged a man who was the physical antithesis of Caspian. Where Caspian was dark and rugged, this man was fair and impeccably dressed. His blonde hair perfectly coiffed his smile smooth and practiced. He introduced himself in the grand hall as Lord Gideon Sterling, their cousin. "Your Grace," he said, bowing low over Serafina's hand, his grip lingering a moment too long. "I came as soon as I heard the astonishing news. I had to offer my congratulations and my condolences in equal measure." His eyes, a pale, watery blue, held a glint of malice. Gideon was the rival claimant Hobbs had mentioned in passing, the one who had stood to inherit everything before Caspian's dramatic return. He oozed a charm that felt slick and insincere. He stayed for dinner that night, filling the cavernous silence with gossip from London and pointed questions disguised as pleasantries. "Tell me, Caspian," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "How does it feel to be back? I imagine running a provincial estate is a touch dull after your adventures abroad. Rumour has it you were leading native armies in the Transvaal, such a savage business. And rumour has it you spend your days at the card table at White's losing money you don't have." Caspian countered his voice, flat and cold. "We all have our savage businesses, cousin." Gideon's smile tightened. He turned his attention to Serafina. "And you, Duchess, a whirlwind romance. Was it no one in London even knew you and Caspian were acquainted? He swept you off your feet, I presume. The question was a trap designed to expose the sham of their marriage." Before Serafina could formulate a careful reply, Caspian spoke. "Our affection is a private matter," he said, his gaze locking with Serafina's across the table. In that look there was a clear instruction. "Follow my lead. It is not for public consumption." Serafina met his gaze and nodded slightly. "Lord Gideon, my husband is a man of action, not of idle chatter. I find it a most compelling quality." The answer, delivered with cool composure, seemed to satisfy and disappoint Gideon in equal measure. He soon departed, promising to call again. "Stay away from him," Caspian warned her after Gideon's carriage had disappeared down the drive. They were standing alone in the hall, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. "His charm is a poison, and he is waiting for us to fail." That night, unable to sleep, Serafina wandered into the disused ballroom. Moonlight streamed through the tall arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. In the corner, covered by a stained canvas sheet, was a grand piano. On impulse, she pulled the sheet away. The ivory keys were yellowed with age, but it was a magnificent instrument. She sat and began to play her fingers, finding a haunting, melancholic Chopin nocturne. The music was a release for all the tension and fear she kept locked inside. She played with her eyes closed, losing herself in the melody. She didn't hear him enter. When the final sorrowful note faded into silence, she opened her eyes to find Caspian standing in the doorway watching her. His face, usually a mask of stern control, was unguarded, his expression one of raw, aching surprise. "I didn't know you played," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "There is a great deal you don't know about me," she replied, her hands still resting on the keys. He walked slowly into the room, his footsteps echoing softly. "My mother used to play that piece. She would sit at this piano and the entire house would fall silent to listen." He stopped beside the piano, his gaze distant, lost in a memory. For the first time, Serafina saw past the soldier, past the vengeful heir to the man beneath. She saw a flicker of the boy who had lost his mother in this cold, lonely house. "It must have been difficult," she said softly. "Growing up here." His jaw tightened, the mask snapping back into place. "The past is of no consequence." "Isn't it?" she challenged gently. "It seems to me the past is the reason we are both here in this room at this moment." He looked at her, then truly looked at her, and she felt a strange, unnerving connection arc between them. It wasn't romantic. It was a shared recognition of their mutual confinement of the ghosts that haunted this house and their lives. "Play again," he commanded, though it sounded more like a request, and so she did. As the beautiful sad music filled the forgotten ballroom, Serafina felt a subtle shift in the air. The man standing in the shadows was still her jailer, her husband in name only, but he was no longer a complete stranger. And that, she realized with a shiver, might be the most dangerous thing of all. The news arrived via a grim-faced Mr. Finch 2 months after the wedding. Old Duke Alaric was dead. He had never recovered from the apoplectic fit at the altar, lingering as a silent, paralyzed prisoner in his Windsor apartments until his malevolent spirit finally gave out. Serafina felt a quiet, uncomplicated relief. The spectre that had loomed over her life was finally gone. For Caspian, the news was more complex. She watched his face as he read the official notice. There was no grief, only a grim finality, the closing of a long and bitter chapter. They buried the old Duke in the Stirling family crypt beneath the chapel at Northwood. It was a cold, wind-swept day, the ceremony attended only by Caspian Serafina, a resentful-looking Gideon, and a handful of estate workers. As the stone slab was rolled into place, sealing Alaric in the darkness with his ancestors, Serafina thought that was the end of it. She was wrong. The old Duke had left one final, poisoned arrow in his quiver. Mr. Finch convened them in the library the following week for the reading of the will. The document was long and filled with vindictive bequests and snubs to distant relatives. But the true venom was saved for the end in a codicil, penned in a spidery weak hand, just weeks before the wedding. The solicitor cleared his throat, his expression grim. Regarding the inheritance of the title and all associated properties, estates, and financial holdings of the Duchy of Northwood, he read, "I, Alaric Stirling, being of sound mind, do hereby decree the following stipulation." He paused, letting the tension build. Caspian stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed his face, impassive stone. Gideon leaned forward in his chair, a predatory eagerness in his eyes. "In the event of my death," Mr. Finch continued, "and the assumption of the title by my nephew Caspian Stirling, he shall only inherit the duchy in its entirety, under one of 2 conditions." Another pause. Serafina's heart began to hammer against her ribs. Condition, the first, that he and his lawfully wedded wife, the Duchess Serafina, produce a legitimate male heir, born within 1 year and 1 day of my passing. A collective intake of breath. Serafina felt the blood drain from her face. 1 year. It was a biological impossibility, and an intimate violation of the careful, sterile pact she and Caspian had made. This was the old Duke's revenge, reaching from beyond the grave, forcing them into the very act he had intended for himself. Gideon Sterling let out a small, triumphant sigh. Or, Mr. Finch went on his eyes, flicking towards Caspian. Condition the second. If no heir is produced in the allotted time, a board of trustees comprised of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Chief Justice, and my cousin, Lord Gideon Sterling. At this, Gideon's smile became a shark's grin. Shall convene to rule on the legitimacy and fitness of the marriage. They must be unanimously convinced that the union is a true and loving partnership, beneficial to the continued good name and prosperity of the Sterling legacy. Should they rule against the union, the marriage shall be deemed a strategic sham, it will be aimed, and the entire duchy and all its holdings shall pass immediately and irrevocably to the next, in the line of succession, Lord Gideon Sterling. The room fell silent. It was a masterful diabolical trap. The old Duke had known of Caspian's pride and Serafina's propriety. He had given them 2 choices: surrender their bodies to each other in a forced act of procreation, or perform a convincing pantomime of love for a panel of judges, one of whom was their greatest enemy. Failure in either meant utter ruin for Caspian and an uncertain, disgraced future for Serafina. The old bastard. Caspian breathed the words a low, venomous rumble. He slammed his fist down on the marble mantelpiece, cracking it. Gideon rose his face, a mask of false sympathy. My. What a predicament. A year and a day. The clock is ticking, cousin. I do wish you and your lovely Duchess the very best of luck. You'll need it. He bowed crisply and sauntered out of the library, whistling softly under his breath. When he was gone, Serafina finally found her voice. "What do we do?" She whispered the words addressed to the furious, rigid line of Caspian's back. He turned slowly, his face a thunderous storm of rage. But when his eyes met hers, the rage was tempered by a grim, shared understanding of their predicament. "We will not be breeding like livestock on his command," he stated, his voice raw. "I will not subject you to that. I will not have my heir, our heir, conceived in a cold bed to satisfy the spite of a dead man." The relief that flooded her was so intense, she felt her knees weaken. He had, without hesitation, rejected the first, most humiliating option. His fierce, unexpected protection of her honor sent a strange warmth through her. "Then we have no choice," she said, thinking aloud. "We must convince them. We must make them believe that we are devoted." He scoffed, pacing the room like a caged panther. "Perform a charade of love for Gideon and the highest powers in the land. They will be watching our every move, every word, every glance. One misstep and he will pounce." "Then we shall not misstep," Serafina said, a new and unfamiliar steel entering her voice. She had been a pawn in this game for too long. First her father's, then the old Duke's, then Caspian's. Now her own future was on the line, as much as his. She would not be a passive piece on the board any longer. She walked towards him, forcing him to stop his pacing and look at her. "You said you wanted to restore the Sterling name. You said you wanted to build a new legacy. You cannot do that if Gideon is Duke. He will sell off the mines, gamble away the land, and let this house rot. Everything you have been working for will be for nothing." He stared at her, surprised by her sudden fire. "We have 1 year." She continued, her mind working with a clarity born of desperation. "We will give them the performance of a lifetime. We will host parties. We will attend functions in London. We will be seen to be the perfect Duke and Duchess. They will not see a flicker of doubt. We will be partners, you and I. A united front. Caspian looked at this woman before him. She was no longer the terrified girl at the altar. The months of isolation and uncertainty had forged something new in her. She was intelligent, resilient, and possessed a will of iron he was only just beginning to appreciate. She was right. This was not a fight he could win with force or fury. It required cunning patience and a partner he could trust. A slow, wolfish grin spread across his face. It was the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his harsh features into something devastatingly handsome. A united front, he repeated, savouring the words. Very well, Your Grace. It seems our marriage of strategy has just entered a new, more theatrical phase. Let us give them a show they will never forget. The theatrical phase of their marriage began with a decisive symbolic act. Caspian moved his belongings from the distant west wing into the suite adjoining Serafina's. The connecting door, long locked and unused, was opened. This single change sent a clear message to the staff, whose whispers were a vital channel of information to the outside world. The Duke and Duchess were now a unified entity. Their chilly formal dinners transformed into intimate strategy sessions. Caspian no longer sat at the far end of the vast table, but beside her, their voices low as they reviewed estate plans and household accounts. He spoke of his ambitions to modernize the duchy, to build safer mines and better homes for the tenants. Serafina, in turn, offered sharp insights into the social and political landscape, her intelligence proving to be as valuable an asset as her grace. They were no longer just a man and a woman bound by a contract. They were co-conspirators, and in their shared purpose, a thrilling and unexpected camaraderie began to flourish. Their first public test was a grand ball at Northwood Manor. The event was designed to reintroduce the duchy to society and present its new masters as a formidable, devoted couple. As Serafina descended the grand staircase on Caspian's arm, dressed in a sapphire gown that matched his eyes, she felt a tremor of stage fright. He sensed it instantly. "Remember," he murmured, his voice a low vibration only she could hear. "We are not asking for their approval. We are commanding it." His hand tightened on hers, a gesture of solidarity that felt profoundly real. The ball was a triumph. Serafina was a vision of ducal elegance, and Caspian, shedding the persona of a brutish soldier, was a commanding and surprisingly attentive host. They opened the floor with a waltz, and for those 3 minutes the performance ceased to be an act. Held securely in Caspian's strong arms, the world of chandeliers and curious eyes blurring around them, Serafina felt a dizzying sense of belonging. When she looked up, she saw not a strategist assessing his audience, but a man looking at her with unguarded admiration, an expression that sent a jolt straight to her heart. Their enemies were, of course, in attendance. Lady Isolde Finch, the bitter daughter of the old Duke's solicitor, attempted to strike with a venomous comment about Serafina's ruined family. Caspian was always drawn to pathetic things, she sneered. Serafina met the attack with a cool smile. Lord Caspian is drawn to strength, Lady Isolde, she replied smoothly. Perhaps that is why his eye never fell on you. She swept away, leaving the woman speechless, feeling a surge of pride in defending not just her own honor, but their shared front. The true threat, however, came from Gideon. A week later, a crisis erupted. An urgent message arrived. Accusations of insolvency were surfacing in Newcastle. Rumors, expertly planted, claimed Caspian was using ducal funds to pay off massive gambling debts from his past. It was a vicious, calculated lie designed to paint him as reckless and untrustworthy in the eyes of the trustees. "It's Gideon's work," Caspian snarled, pacing the library with the fury of a caged animal. "But the scandal alone is enough to poison us, whether it's true or not." Seraphina's mind raced, cutting through the panic. "Gideon is arrogant," she said, her voice steady and clear. He would have used an intermediary he felt he could control. She recalled the faces at the ball. His cousin, Mr. Davies, the nervous man he was whispering with all night. On the pretense of a shopping trip the next day, Seraphina engineered a meeting with Davies. Playing the part of the distressed, naive wife, she lamented the terrible rumors and praised Gideon's support. Flattered by the attention and eager to seem important, Davies took the bait. "Lord Gideon is very clever," he boasted. "The banker he found to hold the debt is a master of discretion. No one will ever trace it back." He trailed off, realizing his mistake too late. But he had revealed the key detail: a banker. Seraphina returned to Northwood with the information. It was all Caspian needed. His agents in London investigated the man and quickly discovered he was deeply indebted to Gideon and had been blackmailed into forging the documents. They had their proof. Gideon's plot had been exposed and neutralized. That evening, the library was quiet, the air thick with a sense of shared victory. The fire crackled in the hearth as they sat together, the tension of the past week finally gone. "You were brilliant," Caspian said, his voice filled with a raw, genuine awe that touched her deeply. "You saved us." "We saved us," she corrected softly. "We are partners." He moved from his chair to sit beside her on the sofa, the space between them charged with an unspoken energy. The pretense had vanished, leaving something powerful and true in its place. He reached out his calloused fingers, gently tucking a stray lock of her hair behind her ear. His touch was a spark against her skin. "Seraphina," he murmured, his voice low and thick with emotion. "This began as a strategy, a war, but it doesn't feel like that anymore." She could only look into his intense blue eyes and see her own feelings reflected there. The respect she felt for him had deepened into admiration, and the admiration had blossomed into a profound, soul-stirring affection. This formidable stranger had become her confidant, her defender, her home. He leaned in, his gaze searching hers, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. When his lips met hers, it was not the passionate performance they might have staged for an audience. It was a kiss of quiet reverence, a tender acknowledgement of the bond forged between them. It deepened with all the pent-up gratitude, relief, and affection of the past months, a silent confession that the greatest lie they had ever told had somehow become their most absolute truth. The Duke's trap had failed. In trying to force a sham union, he had only succeeded in creating an unbreakable one. The final judgment took place in the solemn oak-panelled library of Lambeth Palace. The air was thick with centuries of history, as Seraphina and Caspian faced the three men who held their future in their hands: the weary Archbishop of Canterbury, the sharp-eyed Lord Chief Justice, and a smugly confident Lord Gideon Sterling. Gideon presented his case first, his voice smooth and persuasive. He wove the facts of their union, the Beaumonts' financial ruin, the shocking scene at the altar, into a narrative of cold, cynical ambition. He dismissed their public appearances, particularly the Northwood Ball, as masterful social theatre. "This has never been a marriage of the heart," he concluded, his gaze sweeping across the panel. "It is a business merger, a sham designed to defraud this board and steal my birthright." When it was his turn, Caspian rose with a quiet authority that commanded the room. He did not begin with a defense, but with a simple truth. My cousin is correct about how our union began. He stated, his voice steady. It was born from necessity and conflict. He would have you believe the story ends there. But gentlemen, that is merely where our story began. Caspian spoke not of a whirlwind romance, but of a deep and tested partnership. He described Serafina's intelligence in managing the estate, her courage in facing down their enemies. Then, his voice hardening, he turned his attention to his cousin. Lord Gideon speaks of performances. He should know. He recently staged one of his own hiring a banker to fabricate debts in my name. With a deliberate motion, Caspian produced the banker's signed confession and laid it on the table. This plot, he announced, was uncovered not by my lawyers but by the quick thinking of my wife. A shocked silence fell. Gideon's composure shattered his face, paling to a sickly white. Caspian then turned to look directly at Serafina, his voice softening, filled with an emotion that was clearly not part of any act. The late Duke's will was a trap meant to destroy us. Instead, it forged us. I did not fall in love with a debutante at a ball. I fell in love with my ally, my advisor, and my fiercest defender. The heart of the duchy is not its lands or its titles. It is the person who stands beside you. For me, that is Serafina. The Archbishop then invited Serafina to speak. She rose, her voice trembling only slightly. When I came to the altar, I believed my life was over. She began her words, simple and devastatingly honest. I was a sacrifice, but the man I married did not treat me as property. He treated me as an equal. He did not demand my loyalty. He earned it. He asked for my counsel. He valued my strength, and he protected my honor. She looked from the Archbishop to her husband, her heart in her eyes. Lord Gideon is right about one thing. I did not love my husband on our wedding day. But I stand here now and tell you before God that I love him now. Not for his title, but for his character. My marriage is not a sham. It is the truest and most precious thing in my life. The trustees retired. The minutes that followed were an eternity. Caspian reached for her hand, his grip a solid, unwavering anchor in the silent room. When the arbiters returned, the Archbishop's face was solemn. We have reached a unanimous decision, he declared, his voice echoing in the library. It is the judgment of this board that the union between the Duke and Duchess of Northwood is a true and loving partnership. The terms of the will have been satisfied. The duchy is yours, Your Grace. Relief washed over Serafina in a dizzying wave. It was over. They had won. Gideon sat frozen, his face, a mask of pure, impotent rage. That evening they stood on a balcony, overlooking the glittering expanse of London. The legal battles were finished, the ghosts of the past finally laid to rest. Their future was a blank page waiting to be written. So, Serafina said softly, leaning her head against Caspian's shoulder. What now, Your Grace? He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close in the cool night air. Now, he whispered into her hair, his voice filled with warmth and promise. We go home, and we live. No more performances, no more strategies, just us. She tilted her head up to meet his gaze. He lowered his head and met her lips in a kiss that held no desperation or pretense, only the deep, abiding certainty of a love that had been forged in crisis and had emerged improbably and beautifully, completely real. From a bride of convenience to the Duchess of his heart, Serafina Beaumont's journey was one of sacrifice, shock, and the discovery of a love she never thought possible. She agreed to marry a monster, to save her family, only to find herself bound to a stranger who would become her greatest ally and truest partner. Together they faced down the ghosts of the past, defied a dead man's vengeful plot, and proved that the strongest unions are not always born of courtship and romance, but are forged in the fires of adversity, trust, and unwavering partnership. Theirs is a story that reminds us that sometimes the most unexpected changes in life lead us exactly where we were always meant to be. If their story of sacrifice, unexpected love, and triumph moved you, please show your support by liking this video and sharing it with someone who appreciates a tale of historical romance with a powerful twist. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you never miss another story of love against all odds. Thank you for listening.